Sometimes the biggest fights start over the smallest things. And right now, in Bitcoin, a single, seemingly tiny change to the code has kicked off one of the most intense philosophical battles in its entire history. This isn't just about software, folks. This is a war for the very soul of the network. And we're going to break down exactly what is at stake.
Because that really is the question here, isn't it? We're about to dive into a super technical debate that has totally split the developer community, and it's forcing everyone to ask, what is Bitcoin really for? The stakes? They're unbelievably high.
Okay, so before we get into the fight itself, we need to understand the battlefield. And believe it or not, it all starts with this very specific function hiding in Bitcoin's code.
Let me introduce you to OPR return. The easiest way to think about it is like a tiny permanent memo line on a digital check. It was actually created way back in 2014 as a kind of compromise. See, people were already finding clever ways to store data on the blockchain, but it was messy and was bloating a really critical database. So OPR return was the clean solution, a special, designated spot for small notes that wouldn't gum up the works.
Now, this next part is absolutely crucial to understanding this whole debate. Bitcoin basically has two different kinds of rules. First, you have consensus rules. Think of these as the law of the land. They're fundamental, unbreakable laws, like the 21 million coin limit. If you break one of these, you're not even on the Bitcoin network anymore. You've created something else. But then you have policy rules. These are more like a neighborhood watch's guidelines. They're just local settings for your own computer, your own node, that might filter out certain transactions you don't like. A transaction that breaks your policy is still perfectly valid to the rest of the network.
So here it is, the key to this whole thing. That famous 83-byte limit on the OPR return memo field, it was never the law of the land. It was always just a neighborhood watch guideline, a default setting in the most popular Bitcoin software, Bitcoin Core. A miner could always choose to include a bigger one, and the transaction would be completely valid.
And that little distinction, my friends, that's the tiny spark that lit this massive fire. Because this technical detail has exposed a deep ideological split in the Bitcoin community. It's a clash between two totally different visions for what Bitcoin is even supposed to be.
So in one corner, you have what we can call Team Core. Their philosophy is that Bitcoin has to be a totally neutral, permissionless protocol. If a transaction follows the consensus rules and pays the fee, that's it. It's legit. The free market, the fees, should be the one and only judge. But in the other corner, you have Team Knots. They believe Bitcoin's main, almost sacred purpose is to be sound money. And any data that isn't strictly financial is just spam that clutters up the network and should be actively filtered out to protect that mission. This quote from the core camp really sums up their whole position. It's all about economic purity. Don't let developers decide what's good or bad data. If someone is willing to pay for the block space, they've earned their spot. The cost itself is the only filter you need.
And here's the perfect counterpoint. Team Knots sees the blockchain as this pristine, sacred ledger for a new monetary system. To them, using it as a public bulletin board for random data is just a misuse of a very precious and limited resource. They think the network needs curators to protect its primary goal.
Okay, so we've got the philosophy down. But how does this actually play out in the real world? We're talking spam, censorship, and fees. This is where the rubber really meets the road.
So the critics, especially from that Team Knots camp, they paint a pretty grim picture. They worry that getting rid of this policy limit will just open the floodgates to useless spam, bloating the blockchain. This makes it more expensive for you and me to run our own nodes, which hurts decentralization. And they bring up the very serious fear that the blockchain could be used to permanently store illegal or really harmful content for anyone to see forever.
Okay, but then you see a number like this and it kind of stops you in your tracks. Even with the old policy in place, a recent analysis found that a tiny, minuscule fraction, just 0.007% of these OPR turn transactions were even trying to go over the old limit. It seems like the free market was kind of already enforcing the limit on its own.
And that data point leads us right into the big counter-argument from the core side. The developers who made this change say that trying to filter spam with these little policy rules isn't just a waste of time. It's actually counterproductive and can create even worse problems for the network.
So why do they say filters fail? Well, it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. First, if you block one avenue for data, clever users just find another. They started stuffing data into a different part of the transaction called the witness portion, which is actually cheaper. Second, a filter is pretty useless if not everyone uses it. A transaction can get rejected by 90% of the network, but if it finds its way to just one miner who's happy to take the fee, boom, it's on the blockchain.
And third, this actually encourages a really dangerous behavior. Users start bypassing the public network and sending their transactions directly to big miners, which can lead to centralization and, ironically, more censorship.
This table just breaks it down perfectly. You see, storing data in the witness section, which is what things like ordinals do, is not only cheaper, thanks to a fee discount, but it's also way harder for a node to even identify and filter it. So clamping down on OP return is like plugging one tiny, obvious leak while a much bigger, cheaper, and harder to find hole is right next to it. It just pushes the behavior somewhere else.
So when you take a step back from all the technical jargon, you start to see something fascinating. This isn't a new fight, not at all. It is just the latest battle in a long, long ideological war that goes right back to the very beginning of Bitcoin.
That's right. The exact same arguments we are hearing today were being debated over a decade ago by Bitcoin's creator, Satoshi Nakamoto, and one of its earliest pioneers, Hal Finney.
I mean, just look at this history. Back in 2010, they were already arguing about using Bitcoin for things like timestamping documents. In 2014, OPR return was literally created as a compromise to settle that debate down. Then in 2023, ordinals came along and blew the whole thing wide open again. And now in 2025, removing this little policy limit has brought the exact same philosophical fight right back to the surface. The tech changes, but the core question, it stays exactly the same.
So where does the network actually stand today? Well, Bitcoin Core is still the dominant software, no question. The vast majority of nodes run it. Bitcoin Knots represents a smaller but very, very vocal minority. Now, it's worth noting there's been this recent spike in the number of reported Knots nodes, but a lot of experts think it's a civil attack, which is basically someone trying to stuff the ballot box, spinning up a bunch of fake nodes to make their side look bigger than it really is. The real number is probably closer to that 10% mark.
And after all that, the code, the history, the drama, it all boils down to this one single massive question that everyone in this space has to ask themselves.
What is Bitcoin? Should it be a neutral free-for-all? A true permissionless system where the only barrier to entry is the fee you're willing to pay? A pure free market for block space? Or is it a curated financial system? Something that needs to be actively protected and pruned to preserve its primary role as sound money? This one-line code change has forced that question into the light, and the answer, whatever it is, will define the future of Bitcoin.